Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to answer a question based on our recent discussion of reference recordings, a fabulous concept in which there is a single recording for major works that by consensus represents that piece in a way which is very helpful for collectors who are seeking to A, learn the music, and B, compare the performance to other great performances. Well, the question is this. Are there going to be any new reference recordings? Like recent recordings of things. And the questioner originally expressed a concern about the quality of performances and things like that, but that's not the issue. My answer to that question is it's going to be difficult. It's going to be very difficult going forward to find new reference recordings because it's going to be very, very difficult to identify a consensus choice for recordings of specific works, especially, what does that mean? Especially the most recorded works, the most frequently recorded works. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Let's just do a little summary of where we are in the classical music universe and how lucky some of us were to have been born when we were born. Now, my generation, and that includes a lot of you who are watching, people born, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Let's say that's the generation we're talking about. I was 1961. I'm almost at the end of it, actually. We were very, very lucky because we witnessed the unprecedented flowering and burgeoning of the classical music recording industry. And it wasn't just that there weren't recordings before that. Of course, there were 78s and all that stuff. But there were three technological waves: the advent of the LP, and then stereo, and then digital recording of the compact discs. And the compact disc, those are the major technological waves. I mean, there were little technological rivulets. There was like quad and 8-tracks and cassettes and sound carrier media. But basically, those three huge waves which encouraged the re-recording of the entire repertoire. So there were lots of records that were made, and we were there to absorb them in a way that was absorbable. In other words, someone didn't just throw 500 recordings of Beethoven's Fifth at you. We were there as they came out, so we could listen to them gradually over time. People ask me, how do I remember so many recordings? How do I know what all these recordings are at the overflow room and all this stuff? Well, the answer is I've had 50 years to take them all in. It wasn't like they all got dropped on me at once. I mean, it was a time thing, and spending lots and lots of time listening to lots and lots of recordings, and there's this just enormous discography. So I have a certain fund of knowledge, and so do a lot of you. We are a privileged group. It's never going to happen again, because not only were there these waves of re-recording and massive investment in classical music recordings, but at the same time that was happening, we witnessed the rise of the independent labels like Chandos and Bis and Hyperion and CPO, and you know who they are, who did not just the usual repertoire, but just piles of unusual and different repertoire that would never have otherwise been recorded. They discovered boatloads of extremely fine artists. And while that was happening, we saw an unprecedented investment in classical music performance. That is the advent of these second tier, as we call them, orchestras, which were as good as the first tier orchestras, the radio orchestras, the Scandinavian orchestras, the second tier American orchestras, the second tier British orchestras. Just really fine ensembles who were available to do this stuff. And it wasn't just in orchestras, it was also string quartets and chamber groups and chamber orchestras and opera companies and singers and solo instrumentalists and pianists and violinists. Just an explosion of classical music performance activity and recording as a result of that activity. And again, we were there at the beginning, more or less. What started out as a very limited select market with just a couple of major labels. There were the major labels. There was CBS, RCA, EMI, HMV, and then the Universal people, Decca, Philips, and Deutsche Grammophon. That was the classical music industry. That was it back in the 1960s for the most part. And, you could absorb everything that they did, everything that was released in a month. There were review magazines that published the list of everything that was coming out that month. Then they stopped. Then they went bust. So there was that. Then there was the critical mass of reviewers and review publications. There were a few. There was a handful. There were the major magazines. When I started the Cannes Classical Awards in the 1990s, that was the end of that period, the end of the great record review magazines. I wrote for High Fidelity, and there was Stereo Review, and all of those. There was the American magazines, and Classic Heute in Germany, and Leuster in the Netherlands, and there were just a select few classical music magazines who could all get together. And one of the things that we did in the Cannes Classical Awards, which I did for 10 years, was every year we polled all of the critics and found out what the best recordings were. We had over 200 critics participating in these polls, and voting for the best recordings of the year. I mean, there was consensus. Consensus was possible. But now most of those magazines are gone, and the ones that existed still around have gone digital entirely. But more than that, the critical fraternity has vanished. My colleagues and I, the people I worked with, wonderful, wonderful critics who were of my age, had the same experience that I did. And they worked at magazines and they just got all of this stuff. So everybody had the same basic knowledge base from which to operate. We all saw the same things happening in the industry. All that's gone. It's all just fragmented. It's vanished. First of all, the critical profession is as good as dead, frankly. It no longer matters. I mean, one of the problems is the internet, which is that anybody can set themselves up as a critic. I mean, anybody who has a blog. I mean, like I've done it, anybody can do it. But the problem is that there are no professional standards. And there has to be a shared knowledge base amongst all these critics in order for them to be a consensus that can establish what a reference recording is. And that's just gone. It may exist for certain works in certain niches, but as a generalist project, it's vanished. And the idea of being a critic, I mean, I think it's a noble profession. Well, I mean, it stopped being a profession, basically. And noble, well, I don't know. It's just a bunch of people with opinions. There is, the code of professional ethics and dealing with things in a certain way and having a certain fund of knowledge and a certain level of expertise and an opinion based on, active listening and a knowledge base that everybody shares. Well, I mean, that's just going down the toilet. So, yeah, I mean, there are wonderfully knowledgeable people out there, but that's very different from the profession of being a music critic, which has always been a little bit iffy anyway, always. I mean, major newspapers, they no longer make any difference. Nobody cares what they say. Their budgets for covering cultural activity have been slashed by and large, just about everywhere. Yes. How is it going to be possible for reference recordings to exist going forward, to be selected? What is the process going to be? Well, I honestly can't tell you because it's all going digital. And the circumstances, the situation that allowed for us to choose reference recordings, for us to know what they were, and to have most people agree with them, and to be able to tell you a discographic history of the works in question, which is really what that's all about, that has all evaporated. And will something take its place? I don't really know. But what I do know is that I think that when my generation, I mean, I'm an albatross, when my generation vanishes, a huge amount of knowledge when our generation vanishes. The folks in their let's say 50s, 60s, 70s and up, when we're gone, it's going to be a free-for-all. I don't say that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a fact. It's a fact. The knowledge will go with us. And I mean, at classicstoday.com, my partner and I, David Vernier, and I look constantly. People want to write for us. They want to do things, but we don't see people who have the same knowledge base that we're operating from, the same discographic knowledge. Yes, everybody's got opinions, but who cares? I mean, everyone's got opinions. That makes them all collectively worthless, doesn't it? They're just opinions. But you need more than that. You need more than that if you're going to write criticism. And you certainly need more than that if you're going to arrive at a critical consensus, a consensus that involves both critics and the public. And as regards the public, the other thing that happened, and it's the last thing, is that the big box record stores are gone. Record stores generally are gone. There are very, very few left. Record stores were fabulous. You could go there and you would hang out. I mean, this was where we spent our lives, hanging out at the Tower Records or the HMV or whatever. We would go and we would meet other people and we would all listen to the new releases that came out every month, and we would do it all together. We would have opinions and we would chat, we would talk. That opportunity has been transferred to the internet, to forums such as this one, where we have conversations about these things. But that's different. That's very, very different. It's a different level of participation, I think, and also a different knowledge base in order to participate. So, yeah, it's going to be very, very hard going forward for new reference recordings to arise, the whole culture of classical music delivery and participation and listening has changed. It's changing, and it's fragmented. It's gone in a million different directions, and it's going to make the opportunity to select these reference recordings much, much more difficult, in my view. There will be no shortage of opinions about what reference recordings ought to be, but those opinions are going to have far less foundation, I think, to justify them than they used to. And it may be that the older fund of recordings that are the reference recordings now are just going to become this sort of, ossified list, like the classical canon that never changes, the classical canon of recordings. I don't know. I have no idea. I just know it isn't going to be what it was. That's for damn sure. So I hope this sort of answers your question. Keep on listening, friends, and thanks for joining me and for participating and for sharing all of this knowledge. I know I should stop now, but I just have to make one other point that comes to mind, which is one of the reasons I started this channel is to preserve this knowledge base, which is phenomenal, that you have, that we've all amassed over time. So let's keep going. Take care.